The smell of fresh earth was still clinging to my suit when I pulled up to my son's house. Amara's grave was still open in my mind, just like the searing ache in my chest that had been burning since I watched her lowered beneath the wilting flowers. It had barely been 24 hours since I buried her, and my legs were still shaking from the exhaustion of the wake, the sleepless nights, and the sheer weight of the years we'd shared, which now felt like another body I had to carry. I stopped in front of the gate, taking a deep breath, expecting silence, grief, some respect. But instead, I heard music, laughter, glasses clinking, a full-blown celebration right on the other side of the door, while my whole world had just died. I moved slowly toward one of the side windows, like someone approaching a fire, unsure if anyone was still trapped inside. And there they were, my son, Aiden, a drink in his hand, laughing with his wife, Chantel, and a few guests. The lights were blazing, bottles lined the table, the music was loud. This wasn't a discreet gathering. It was an open, brazen party. I felt a knot rise from my stomach to my throat. My hands gripped the window frame to keep from collapsing. Then I heard her, my daughter-in-law, Chantel, with that voice always dripping with venom. "If it were up to me," she sneered, "we'd be dancing on that woman's grave right now." Laughter exploded around her. Aiden joined in. And that was the moment I saw him glance toward the window, see me, and immediately duck out of sight. I don't know how long I stood there, watching him disappear from my line of sight like a guilty child. Something inside me broke, something that had already been cracked for years. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat, making sure the envelope was still there. I took a slow breath, walked to the front door, and didn't ring the bell or knock. I simply turned the knob and walked in. Now, before I continue, I would like to know if you subscribed to the channel and if you liked the video. It helps me know you're supporting me and enjoying my stories. Now, let's keep going. The music cut out immediately when I crossed the threshold. The laughter vanished like candles blown out by the wind. Every head turned to stare at me. I was still wearing the same black overcoat from the funeral. The funeral ribbon was still pinned to my lapel. The contrast between my dark suit and the guests' flashy clothes, the open bottles, and the smell of liquor was almost obscene. No one knew what to say, and no one dared to move. I watched as some of the guests recognized me and quickly dropped their eyes in shame. Others just stared at me with morbid curiosity. Then she appeared, the very woman who, moments ago, had wanted to dance on my wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" Chantel asked, without a hint of guilt. I didn't answer right away. I took a couple of steps into the house. I looked at the artwork, the furniture, the details that my wife, Amara, had chosen with such care over the years. Everything looked the same, except the soul of the place was gone. "I came to see my son," I answered calmly. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Well, today isn't a good day for mourning," she replied. "We're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" I asked, looking around. "Our new project," she said with a smug look. "Now that everything's about to change." I searched for Aiden. I saw him in the back, near the kitchen, trying to make himself invisible behind two people. I took a few more steps, my eyes locked on him. "Come out," I ordered in a low voice. He didn't move. "I'm talking to you, son," I repeated. Finally, he stepped out from behind the crowd. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His shirt was wrinkled, his face sweaty, guilt etched into every movement. "Pop, he stammered. I cut him off. "Yesterday, I buried your mother." The silence in the room became thick, like a wall. "Yesterday," I continued, "I carried the casket. I watched them cover her with dirt. I went home to an empty house, with only her clothes, her scent, her absence. And today, I come here and find this. Aidan tried to speak again, but Chantel beat him to it. Don't be dramatic, she said. Your wife was sick anyway. These things happen. Life goes on. I felt the blood roaring in my ears. Life goes on for those who still have a soul, I replied. She raised an eyebrow in contempt. Look, old man, we aren't changing our plans because of a funeral. That sentence was the final nail in the coffin of everything I thought I had built as a father. I looked at my son. Is this what you're going to tell me? I asked him. That your mother's death is just an inconvenience to your plans? My words fell like heavy stones. He swallowed hard. Pop, don't do this here. I'm doing it right here, I answered. Because you disgraced her right here. The guests started mumbling, uncomfortable. Some looked for their coats. Others pretended to check their phones. Chantel crossed her arms. You're going to cry here like some ridiculous old man, she scoffed. Your wife can't even get in the way anymore. It was then I understood that arguing was useless, shouting was useless, and hitting was useless. They wouldn't understand a single thing through words. So, I did something else. I pulled the envelope out of my coat and placed it on the central table slowly. Carefully, everyone watched the gesture. What is that? Aidan asked. What comes after the laughter? I replied. I opened it in front of them and let the documents fall onto the table one by one. Copies of property deeds, bank statements, contracts, notarial papers. Do you recognize these signatures? I asked him. Aidan went pale. That's in Mama's name, he whispered. It was Brown, I corrected. Now it's in mine. Chantel stepped forward. That's a lie, she spat. That house, that money, those businesses, all of that belongs to my husband. I shook my head. None of this belongs to you, I answered. It never did. I picked up one of the documents. Your mother made everything perfectly clear in her will. The house, the accounts, the property, the savings, everything. I am the universal heir. The murmur turned into a frightened, buzzing sound. My son was looking at me as if I wasn't his father anymore, but a dangerous stranger. Pop, this isn't even a good time, he whispered. It was never a good time to respect your mother, I answered. So now, it's not a good time to ask for anything either. Chantel slammed her hand on the table. This is an abuse, she yelled. You can't take everything from us. I'm not taking anything from you, I said calmly. I'm just putting everything back in its rightful place. She looked at me with pure hatred. And what do you plan to do now? She spat. Ruin our lives? I looked her straight in the eyes. I didn't answer. You two already took care of ruining my wife's life. I'm just going to make sure you never laugh at her grave again. And without another word, I turned around. I walked out of that house amidst stunned looks, bottles trembling on the tables, dead music in the speakers, and laughter frozen in throats that no longer knew what to do with their own cruelty. As I closed the door behind me, I knew that was only the beginning. The party was over, and the real bill was just starting to come due. I didn't cry when I left that house. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I walked to my sedan with a calm that even I didn't understand. Only when I turned the key and the engine roared did I feel my hands trembling. It wasn't fear. It was the definitive confirmation of something I had been denying for years. The son I had raised no longer existed. In his place was an empty man, ruled by contempt and by a woman who had learned to mock the pain of others as if it were a sport. I drove aimlessly for several minutes. The image of Amara buried was still burning in my memory, now mixed with the laughter from that profane party. I thought of every sacrifice she made for her son, the double shifts at the hospital when he was little, the sleepless nights waiting for him to come home safe, the times she justified his mistakes to me so as not to break the bond. All of it, just to end up hearing them say they'd dance on her grave. When I got home, the silence hit me with unexpected force. The absence wasn't just physical anymore. It was betrayal. I sat down in the armchair where I had shared so many cups of coffee with my wife. The wall clock marked the hours with a sound like a hammer. I took one of her scarves from the back of a chair and brought it to my face. It still held her faint perfume. For the first time all day, I cried. I didn't cry for the death. I cried for the humiliation. After about an hour, my phone vibrated. It was Aiden. I let it ring until the screen went dark. He called again, and again, I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because it still hurt too much to hear his voice. On the fourth call, I let it go to voicemail. I knew that silence could also be a punishment. That same night, while I was preparing something to eat, without any appetite, a message arrived from him. "Pop, we need to talk. This is out of control. It's not what it looks like." I read those words several times. It's not what it looks like. The favorite phrase of those who have already been caught. I didn't reply. The next day, very early, there was a knock on the door. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. I opened it slowly. Aiden stood there, his eyes tired, his beard scruffy, deep circles under his eyes. He smelled of stale liquor and poorly concealed desperation. "Pop," he said as soon as he saw me, "we have to fix this." I didn't hug him. I didn't shake his hand. I simply stepped aside so he could enter. He sat down opposite me at the kitchen table, exactly in the same place where my wife had served him his favorite meals so many times. It took him a few seconds to speak. "She exaggerated," he began, referring to Chantel. "The party was just to distract us from the bad time." "Distraction from the burial?" I asked, in a neutral voice. He looked down. "Things were said without thinking." "They were thought about for years," I replied. "Yesterday you just got the nerve to say them out loud." He tried to defend himself. "Pop, you don't understand our life, our pressures, our debt." "Don't talk to me about debt," I interrupted him. "You know I've been sending you money every month for 5 years. I never asked too many questions, never demanded explanations. I always thought I was helping a son. Now, I'm not so sure who I was financing." His face tensed. "Did she say something to you?" he asked suspiciously. "She didn't need to say anything," I replied. "Yesterday you said everything with your silence." He got up from the chair with an abrupt gesture. "Pop, you're letting anger influence you. You're making a mistake." I looked at him squarely. "The only mistake I made was believing that you were still the man I raised." His eyes watered for an instant, but immediately hardened. "We need that money," he said. "We have obligations." "Your mother had obligations too," I replied. "And even so, she never stopped helping when you asked." "She's gone now," he suddenly yelled. The echo of his shout hung suspended between the walls. I took a deep breath. "Precisely because she's gone," I said calmly. "I'm finally hearing what I refused to hear before." He ran a hand over his face. "If you take everything away from us, you'll destroy us." "No," I replied. "I'm just letting the truth do its job." He was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. "She," he finally said, "she never really loved you." I felt the blow, though it didn't hurt as much as I expected. That doesn't matter, I answered. I loved her. He stood up again. So what are you going to do? He asked, defiant. Ruin us to honor a dead woman? I stood up with effort. I'm not honoring a dead woman, I said. I'm protecting what she built with her life. He held my gaze for a few more seconds, and then turned toward the door. Are you going to regret this? He murmured. I already regret, I answered, not having seen who you were sooner. He left without saying goodbye. The sound of the door closing was dry, definitive. I sat down again in the chair. The trembling returned to my hands. This time, it wasn't from pain. It was from resolution. That same afternoon, I went to the bank. I requested all the account statements, asked for preemptive blocks, and began the procedures for reviewing past transactions. The bank manager looked at me with surprise. She had never seen my name on such firm requests before. It's due to my wife's passing, I explained. I need to review everything. I wasn't lying. It was just that the review had a different purpose now. From there, I went to the office of the lawyer who had been working with us for years. I asked him for a certified copy of the will, the powers of attorney, every document signed by Amara. As I reviewed them one by one, I understood how careful she had been. She had foreseen everything, even this. When I returned home, it was already getting dark. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't Aiden, it was Chantel. You miserable old man, she said, without even greeting me. You think you're so clever. I didn't reply. I think I'm a widower. You're robbing us, she screamed. All of that is ours. Nothing that comes from contempt belongs to anyone, I replied calmly. We're going to sue you, she threatened. You have every right, I said. And I have mine. I hung up without waiting for an answer. That night, I slept little, not because of fear, but because of the memories. I saw Aiden as a boy, running toward his mother after a fall. I saw Amara smile at him with that tenderness she never lost. I saw the man who was now threatening me with lawsuits and ruin. And I understood something with brutal clarity. I no longer had a son. I had an enemy with my blood. And when blood spoils, you don't save it with words. You cut it off. I entered Amara's bedroom for the first time since her death with a respect that bordered on fear. The air was still permeated with her soft perfume, the one she never wanted to change because she said that scents were also a form of memory. I slowly sat down and took the small notebook from the nightstand, one I had never seen before, alongside her glasses and a rosary. The cover was simple, without a name. Opening it, I found her handwriting, neat but trembling on some pages. They weren't domestic notes as I first thought. They were dates, short phrases, names, and between the lines, a pain she never showed me directly. Today, he asked me again not to say anything. Says he's our son, not to make him look bad. He begged me not to tell you. I felt my stomach turn over. I immediately understood that she wasn't referring to just anything. Each page unfolded a parallel story that had happened in front of my eyes without me ever seeing it. I kept reading. I saw him raise his voice to her. She was shaking. I was too. He asked me for money again, says it's to pay debts, but I don't know who to. She cried in the bathroom. She asked me not to tell you anything, that you already have too many worries. I pressed the notebook against my chest. Amara had known much more than I had ever imagined, and she had kept silent, not out of cowardice, but out of shame, out of fear that I would see what our son had become, to protect two worlds at once, hers and mine. I got up and opened the wardrobe. Among her neatly arranged clothes, I found an envelope hidden behind a shoebox. Inside were more papers. transfer receipts, copies of printed messages, loan applications signed by Aiden, sums of money that could no longer be justified by any normal support. I sat on the edge of the bed. All of this had been happening under my emotional roof, without my knowledge. My wife had been the dam holding back a tide of financial abuse, veiled humiliations, and blackmail disguised as need. I remembered every time she minimized an argument, every time she justified our son's disrespect, every time she asked me not to intervene, not to pressure him, that he would change eventually. I accepted it out of love and blind trust. At the bottom of the envelope, I found a letter addressed to me. It was dated nearly 2 years ago. She never gave it to me. Frank, if you are reading this, it is because I no longer had the strength to say it directly. Our son is not the man we thought we raised. Sometimes he asks me for money with a harshness that frightens me. His wife openly despises me. I have seen something in their eyes that I don't know how to name. I wanted to protect you from this pain. Forgive me. Tears fell onto the paper. I had been protected with white lies while she was crumbling inside. That same day, I checked an old laptop we no longer used. In a hidden folder, I found more messages, emails, saved audio. Chantel mocked Amara. She called her a useless old woman. She complained that she was still alive and preventing them from inheriting faster. Aiden didn't stop her. Sometimes he joined in. One phrase was etched in my mind like a curse. When she dies, we'll finally be free. I closed the laptop forcefully. I had never hated anyone until that moment. I went out to the patio and let myself drop into the wicker chair where we had shared sweet tea on so many afternoons. I looked at the cloudy sky without really seeing it. I had moved from grief to something darker, revelation. I wasn't just crying for my wife anymore. I was crying for the family I never knew was already broken. I understood with unbearable clarity that Amara had died carrying a weight that wasn't hers. She had held up lies, excuses, and humiliations in the name of a son who had let go of her hand long before she let go of life. And I had been distracted, growing old peacefully, believing that problems were normal, that tensions were temporary, and that time would sort everything out. It didn't sort it out. It just hid it. That afternoon, I reread every document with cold calm. The money Aiden was managing wasn't his. It never had been. Amara had put property in his name only to facilitate paperwork, never to give it away. The constant loans weren't for urgent need, but to plug holes I still couldn't fully gauge. I began to understand that the revenge I was starting to plot wasn't just about the party, Chantel's words, or even the visible betrayal. It was for the years of my wife's forced silence. When night fell, the phone rang again. It was Chantel. I didn't answer. Then Aiden called. Him either. I turned on the lamp in Amara's bedroom and sat there alone, with her clothes still hanging intact. I spoke to her out loud for the first time since I buried her. Forgive me, I told her. Forgive me for not having known, for having believed in someone who no longer deserved faith. But I swear, they will never laugh at you again. I stayed there until the early hours of the morning, reviewing her life and the lie that surrounded her at the end. I understood that she didn't die only from sickness. She died from contained sadness, from accumulated disappointment, from misspent love. By sunrise, I was decided. I no longer doubted. I had the evidence in my hands, the genealogy of contempt, the exact map of the betrayal. And I also had something more valuable, the portions only age can give. Aiden and Chantel still thought this was just an argument over inheritance. They couldn't imagine that what I had discovered turned their greed into an early confession. The revenge was no longer just moral, it was legal and complete. I put all of the papers back in the envelope and left it on the dining room table. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and drank it slowly, like someone saying goodbye to a previous life, because what was about to begin wasn't the outburst of a wounded old man. It was an accounting with the truth, and nothing was going to stop it. The first move had to be silent. No shouting, no threats, just papers, signatures, and precise timing. That had always been Amara's way. Discreet, meticulous, invisible. I was going to avenge her using her own language. That morning, I left the house early with the envelope under my arm. The sky was gray, as if it, too, refused to look at what was about to happen. I walked into the bank, where we had deposited our savings together for years. The manager recognized me immediately and offered me a seat with an automatic smile. While drinking coffee, I calmly handed her the documents. "My wife passed away," I said. "I need to review all accounts in her name and the associated powers of attorney." The woman lowered her voice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Pierce." Her fingers began sliding quickly across the keyboard. The minutes passed slowly. I stared at an abstract painting on the wall in front of me, not really seeing it. Every second that passed was one more piece of the mechanism closing around my son. "Here is everything," she finally said. "Your wife had several accounts in her name that were not listed as joint. I also see there were periodic transfers to an account linked to your son." I nodded. "Exactly. And I need to stop them." Her expression tensed for just a second. "That will be immediate." I signed. One stroke. Another. The money stopped flowing at that very moment. "I also want to register that all future operations must require my exclusive authorization," I added. "It will be done," she replied. When I left the bank, the air tasted different. It wasn't relief, it was recovered control. I walked a few blocks to the CPA's office, who had handled Amara's taxes for years. There, I found another truth hidden among numbers. Debts I didn't know about, poorly justified credits, money movements that didn't correspond to her declared income. Everything bore the twisted pulse of desperation. "Your son is in far more debt than we thought," the CPA told me cautiously. "And those debts were being covered with your wife's funds." I gritted my teeth. "Not anymore," I replied. From there, I went to the county clerk's office. I requested certificates of title for every piece of property: the house where they lived, the 2 plots of land, the commercial building. Everything was still in Amara's name. Everything. I left with the documents in my hand, trembling, not from exhaustion, but from certainty. That same afternoon, I received the first desperate call. It was Aiden. "Pop, something happened with the bank," he said, trying to sound calm. "The transfers didn't go through." "Yes," I replied. "What was supposed to happen happened." We have payments due today," he insisted. "People who won't wait." "Your mother didn't expect you to bury her with music and drinks either," I replied in a flat voice. There was silence on the other end. "Are you playing with fire?" he finally said. "No, son," I answered. "You played with the wrong grave." I hung up. That night, 4 more calls rang. None were answered. Then came the messages, some pleading, others threatening. I read them without rush, like someone reviewing a script they already knew. The next day, I went to the office of the lawyer Amara had secretly consulted months ago. He received me with grave respect. "Your wife was a very cautious woman," he told me as he opened the file. "She knew exactly what to do." He showed me the full will. There were no loopholes. Every clause was designed like a wall. The entire inheritance passed into my hands. Aiden appeared in only one line. He would be excluded from any direct financial benefit until he met certain behavioral conditions that he had never fulfilled. She already knew, I murmured. She knew, the lawyer confirmed, and she was preparing. For the first time since her death, I felt pride for her, without pain clouding my vision. My wife had not been a passive victim. She had been resisting, in silence. I left the office with the absolute certainty that the law was on my side. That afternoon, Chantel showed up at my house unannounced. She pounded on the door as if she still had a right to do so. I opened it calmly. "What did you do?" she screamed at me without a greeting. "The accounts are blocked. The vendors are calling us." "Get in line, Da," I replied. "Everyone gets their turn. This is an episode of power." She is what I. "That money is ours." "No, then," I said. "That money belonged to a woman you despised, even on her grave." She tried to shove past me to enter. I stood firm in the doorway. "You have no authority here." "I do," I answered. "Legally and morally." She looked at me with hatred that no longer impressed me. "My husband is going to confront you." "Let him try," I said. "I've waited years for him to dare to look at me without hiding." She left, slamming the storm door shut. That very night, I received a court notification. They had tried to initiate action against me for wrongful retention of funds. I smiled bitterly. They didn't know what they were playing with. The next day, I was summoned to the courthouse. I showed up with all the documents under my arm. The judge reviewed every paper carefully. "You are the direct heir," he confirmed, "and you are acting within the law." The complaint was rejected immediately. When I left, I knew the real panic would now begin for them. That afternoon, I saw them from across the street arguing in their window, shouting, gesturing, accusing. The castle they had built on contempt was beginning to crack from the foundations. Aiden called me again that evening. His voice no longer held arrogance. "Pop, we're drowning," he said in a broken voice. "Help me." I was silent for a few seconds. "I ran out of air too, when I saw you dancing on your mother's memory," I replied. "Breathe that same emptiness now." "She exaggerated," he said, with a weak flicker of hope. "You applauded her with your silence," I replied, "and that weighs more than any word." I hung up once more. That night, for the first time, I slept without dreams. I no longer saw Amara's face covered in dirt. I saw documents, signatures, frozen accounts, firm steps. The money that was never Aiden's had returned to its course. And with each passing day, the lie he had built was losing oxygen. I wasn't celebrating. I was executing. Because justice, when it arrives late, doesn't shout. It falls silently, like a perfect slab of a stone. The call came at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was Amar's lawyer. His voice sounded grave, professional, with no trace of surprise. "Mr. Pierce, we can now proceed with the official reading of the will before the interested parties. Your son and daughter-in-law have been legally notified. They must appear this afternoon." I hung up without responding. I knew that day would mark a point of no return. I dressed in the same dark suit I had worn to the burial. Not for drama, but for memory. Amara had planned everything in silence, and I wasn't going to betray her with a careless gesture. I arrived at the lawyer's office 15 minutes early. I sat in the waiting room with my hands clasped on my cane. I looked at the floor for a long time. I wasn't thinking about revenge at that moment. I was thinking about her, about how she must have written every line of that document with a tight chest, knowing that one day I would be there, upholding her last wishes. Aiden was the first to arrive. He was alone, without his wife. He walked with tense shoulders, his gaze full of mistrust. He didn't greet me. He sat down at the opposite end of the room. 5 minutes later, Chantel walked in, wearing a light suit, too elegant for a room where her last hope was about to be buried. She looked at me with open contempt and sat next to my son, taking his arm as if she still had something to hold on to. "Don't worry," she whispered to him. "It can't be that bad." I remained silent. The lawyer opened the door to the main room and let us in. We sat around a rectangular table. In front of each of them was a closed folder. Mine was empty. Theirs was not. "We will proceed with the reading of the late Mrs. Pierce's will," the lawyer announced. "Document signed and legalized 18 months ago." I saw Aiden frown. Chantel pressed her lips together. The lawyer began to read in a clear voice, without drama. Each phrase fell like a drop of acid onto the table. "I declare my husband, Franklin Pierce, the universal heir of all my assets, rights, and actions. I expressly exclude my son from any direct administration over the assets until the conditions of conduct stipulated herein are met." Aiden stiffened in his chair. "The disposal, sale, blocking, or transfer of the properties and funds remaining under the exclusive power of my husband." The lawyer paused briefly to turn the page. I felt my pulse steady. Aiden opened his mouth. "That's not possible." The lawyer interrupted him with implacable courtesy. "I ask you to wait until I finish the reading," he continued. "It is established that any attempt at pressure, threat, emotional manipulation, or defamation against my husband will definitively nullify any future possibility of reconsideration. I declare that I make this decision in full use of my mental faculties, having witnessed behaviors that I consider incompatible with the dignity, respect, and values I attempted to instill." The silence became heavy. The lawyer closed the document. "That is all," he said. "The will is fully valid." Aiden looked at me as if I had just pulled a weapon across the table. "You did this," he said in a trembling voice. "You forced her." I shook my head. "She did it alone," I replied. "Just like she should have done years ago." Chantel pointed a finger at me. "You're leaving us on the street," she yelled. "Is that what you want?" "No," I replied calmly. "That's what you provoked." Aiden hit the table. "That was just a party." "It was blasphemy on your mother's grave," I replied, "and on all the years she supported you without asking for anything in return." Chantel moved closer to me, her eyes bloodshot with rage. "If you think you're going to live peacefully after this, you're dead wrong." "I'm more peaceful than I have been in the last 10 years, I replied. The lawyer stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is adjourned." As we left the office, Aiden caught up to me in the hallway. "Pop," he said in a thin voice, "we can still fix this." I looked him in the eye for the first time since Amara's death. "No," I said. "You broke what cannot be fixed with words." Before I continue, tell me in the comments what you think of this story so far and what you would do in my place. Don't leave the video, because what comes next will give you chills. Chantel was shouting threats from behind, words I barely remembered as I reached the street. I walked to my car with a calm that surprised even me. I started the engine and drove without looking back. That same afternoon, the real consequences began. The banks executed the definitive blocks. Vendors demanded past due payments. The Asrites, who had been close to Aiden until the day before, started disappearing like shadows at sunrise. At 9 o'clock that night, he called me again. "Pop, we're in serious trouble," he said, choked up. "Dangerous people are demanding their money. My life was also demanded the day I saw you dance on your mother's grave," I replied. "I don't owe anyone anything. You do." "They're going to hurt us," he whimpered. "You should have thought about that before you laughed at a grave," I replied. "Now, be responsible for your own dark night." I hung up. Minutes later, it was Chantel who called. She was crying. "Mr. Pierce, please, I was wrong. I didn't mean it." "Words don't always come from error," I replied. "Sometimes they come from the soul." "We came to ask for forgiveness," she said. "Give us back at least some of it." "You already took all the dignity out of that house," I replied. "Don't ask me to give back what you never cared for." I hung up. That night, I sat in my dining room with the inheritance documents in front of me. I lit a candle next to Amara's photo. "It is done," I whispered to her. "Rest." In the distance, I heard sirens. I didn't know if they were going for them. I didn't need to know. The consequences had already been unleashed. And while my son and his wife began to realize they had lost everything without ever having truly owned it, I understood that Amara's will wasn't just a legal document. It was her last defense and my first victory. The collapse began quietly, as all true catastrophes do. There were no explosions or screams in the first few days, just phones ringing unanswered, emails without response, and doors closing one after another. From my house, I could see the nervous back and forth of shadows behind the curtains of Aiden's house. They were constantly coming and going. There was no more music, no laughter, no luxury cars parked. Just urgency, muffled arguments, and a tense stillness that heralded a storm. That silence carried a new weight, dense, as if the air itself had thickened. Aiden stopped calling me after the last conversation. That was also a sign. Only those who no longer expect anything break contact completely. Chantel, however, persisted with messages that were increasingly erratic, pleading, insults, promises, threats. The same pain adopting different masks. I read them in silence, without responding, not out of cruelty, but because every word of mine was already written in the documents she had despised. The law spoke for me now. For the first time in many years, I didn't have to explain anything, justify myself, or ask permission. Everything was moving forward without me, just as it should. The rumors began circulating through the neighborhood with the speed of bad news. The bar they had staked everything on was closed for several days. They said vendors were no longer extending credit. Employees were demanding back pay. And some partners had withdrawn their share before the collapse. I heard everything from third parties, always in a low voice, as if my grief had become a respectable secret. No one dared to ask me anything directly. My mourning was public. Their ruin was still just a whisper. But the collapse was already underway, and nothing would stop it now. One afternoon, two men who didn't look like they were from the neighborhood knocked on my door. Dark suits, cold eyes, tense manners. They said they came to inquire about some guarantees that no longer existed. I didn't open the door all the way, not because I feared for myself, but because I understood that my son's world of debt had become contaminated with a kind of person who doesn't forgive delays or failures. I gave them the minimal necessary information and closed the door without arguing. That visit confirmed that the fall was no longer just economic. It had entered territories where regret has no value or price. That same night, Aiden reappeared, not at my door, but on my phone. His voice no longer held rage, just a poorly disguised desperation. He spoke to me of millions that didn't exist, impossible deadlines, veiled threats. I listened to him with a calm that surprised me. For the first time, the scales were balanced. He spoke from fear. I spoke from certainty. And fear, when it doesn't govern the other, loses all its power. No screams, no promises, no pleas, I told him, before hanging up. Only numbers will now fall upon your conscience. His silence was my answer. On the third day, a notice of eviction was taped to my son's fence. I knew before he even told me. A neighbor, with a low voice and an uncomfortable look, informed me what it was about. I didn't feel joy or pity. I felt the exact, heavy weight of a consequence being fulfilled. No one can sustain a big lie when the money that feeds it is taken away. Aiden always believed that the world bowed to the one who shouted the loudest. He never learned to kneel before the truth. Now the truth was pushing him down. Chantel, on the other hand, chose the path of spectacle. She called distant relatives, cried on social media, talked about betrayal, injustice, and a cruel father-in-law who wanted to see them in misery. Some believed her, many didn't, but opinion doesn't pay debts, and soon her words were left without an echo. Public tears dry quickly when reality starts knocking hard on the door. I observed everything from the distance of someone who no longer wants to convince anyone, just to survive peacefully at the end of their own days. My grief remained mine, silent, but firm as a rock. The first night they slept without electricity was also the first night Aiden accepted that everything was over. He called me after midnight. His voice was broken by fatigue and fear. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for a place to hide. I understood then that his pride was completely exhausted. But compassion cannot be imposed with pleas when the damage has been too deep. I told him to go to a bank, a shelter, any place that wasn't the memory of his betrayed mother. I hung up without trembling this time. The following days were a succession of gray news, the auction of furniture, the definitive closure of the business, the flight of some supposed friends. I saw Aiden walk down the street in wrinkled clothes, thinner, suddenly older. We crossed paths once in the distance. He didn't greet me, I didn't either. In that silence, everything that was beyond repair was said. I understood then that there are losses that don't involve caskets or flowers. They only involve names that cease to be spoken. His, for me, had died the day of the party, at that very moment. I, on the other hand, returned each evening to a silent house that was slowly starting to hurt less. I spoke to Amar's photo, as one converses with a real presence. I told her about every step, every document, every fall. I wasn't seeking her approval. I was seeking to fulfill an intimate promise that no one would ever mock her memory again without paying a price. The revenge continued its course, slow, firm, inevitable, like the advance of the seasons. And although there were still chapters to be written, I knew that the collapse was already complete on the inside. It was only a matter of time before the world confirmed it. The rain was falling, with a sad consistency that afternoon. It beat against the porch roof as if someone were knocking on an invisible door. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a short ring. It was long, desperate. Something in that sound let me know who was on the other side, even before I looked out the window. I left the cup on the table and walked slowly, leaning on my cane. I didn't rush anything. I had learned that another person's desperation is not calmed by haste, but by firmness. I opened the door, and there was my son, soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his beard grown out for days, his eyes sunken. There was no trace left of the man who had been toasting with drinks the day after his mother's death. In front of me was only a body defeated by fear and ruin. "Pop," he said faintly. "Please?" I didn't answer him. I stepped back to let him enter. I closed the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking was dry, definitive, like everything we were about to say. He walked to the living room like someone stepping across a field of debris. He looked at the floor, the furniture, the walls. Everything seemed alien to him. He stopped in front of the armchair where his mother used to sit. He swallowed. "They're going to take the house," he said in a low voice. "Everything." I sat across from him without taking off my coat. "I warned you," I replied. "Debts don't hide under anyone's grave." He ran both hands over his face, his fingers trembling. "She pushed me into all of this," he said, referring to Chantel. I just wanted to feel like I was worth something." "And you decided to prove it by mocking your dead mother," I replied. He didn't look up. "I was drunk. You were sober when you abandoned her while she was alive," I countered. We remained in silence for a few eternal seconds. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm. "The creditors came again today," he confessed. "They're never good people. Those who live off other people's money," I replied. Aiden slowly fell to his knees in front of me. The thud of his knees against the floor echoed in the room, not because it was loud, but because I had never seen him humiliate himself like that. "I beg you," he said with a broken voice. "Save me, Pop. Just this once." I looked down at him. I didn't see the boy. I was unable to protect from his own shadow. I saw the man who chose his path. "Your mother saved you hundreds of times in silence," I replied. "I don't have that gift anymore." He raised his face, tears streaming openly. "If you don't do something, she's going to leave," he said, "and I'll be left alone." "She and your mother were left alone many nights, too," I retorted. "Alone with your contempt." "I didn't hate her," he whimpered. "I just stopped seeing her." "That's the beginning of all cruelties," I replied. "When you stop seeing the other person as human." He hit the floor with his hand. "Give me a chance," he cried. "Just one." I felt the collapse in his voice. I didn't celebrate. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't smile. I just took a deep breath. "Opportunities are not begged for on your knees," I said. "They are earned with actions. And you exhausted yours when you turned the grieving into a party." "She manipulated me," he whispered. I didn't know who I was anymore. "Your mother knew that too," I replied. "And yet she held you up until she ran out of strength." Aiden rested his forehead against the floor. He cried silently. The water from his wet clothes dripped onto the carpet like a miserable clock. "We were cruel," he admitted. "Not just to her, to both of you." For the first time since I saw him, his voice sounded sincere. "I know," I said. "That's why you are here." He slowly got up. "Then help me." "I didn't come into the world to save you from consequences," I replied. "I came to teach you that they exist." He shook his head, desperate. "If we fall now, we won't get up again." "Your mother didn't get up either," I replied. "And you never carried her." He clenched his fists. "I didn't know how much I was hurting her." "Yes, you did," I countered. "You just chose not to look." He fell back onto his heels. "I'll give you everything," he said. "I'll leave her. I'll work anywhere. I'll do whatever you want. You should have promised that to your mother when she could still hear you." I looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment, so profound that it no longer hurt. It was an old, worn-out sadness. "Get up," I finally ordered. He obeyed with difficulty. "I won't help you with money," I said. "Not now, not ever again." His eyes filled with panic. "Then this is the end." "No," I replied. This is the beginning of your truth." He took a step back. "She won't handle this," he said. "She'll turn against me, just like you turned against your mother." "She already fell," I said. "Today you leave with nothing. Out of this house, out of my accounts, out of my support. But you won't leave without something else." He shook his head, confused. "What thing?" I reached into the table drawer and pulled out his mother's notebook. I held it out to him. "This." He took it with the trembling hands. "Read," I said. "All of it." His eyes moved quickly over the first pages. Color slowly drained from his face. "She knew everything," he whispered. "Yes," I replied. "And she still protected you until the end." Tears now streamed down his face, unchecked. "I'm a monster. That's for you to decide starting today," I said. "But not with me." He stood there for a long time, staring at those pages like someone observing a corpse. Finally, he spoke. "I can't change anything, can I?" "No," I replied. "But you can carry it without running away." He stood up slowly. "I never thought I'd end up like this." "No one thinks they'll end up where their actions take them," I replied. "But they always arrive." He walked toward the door without looking back at me. "Pop." I didn't answer. He opened the door. The cold and the rain enveloped him again. Before crossing the threshold, he stopped. "Now I know I don't have a father anymore." "You lost him before you lost your roof," I replied without hatred. "When you made your mother die twice, once in life and again in her memory." He left. I closed the door. I leaned on it for a few seconds. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief, just the heavy certainty that sometimes pity consists of not saving someone who never wanted to save anyone else. Amara's notebook remained open on the table. I looked at it for a long time. "Rest," I murmured to her. "I'm not holding it up anymore." And for the first time since her death, I felt that her silence was no longer a wound. It was a definitive farewell. The rumor spread before I said a single word. Sometimes the truth doesn't need direct witnesses. It breaks through on its own, like a crack running through a wall from the inside. Neighbors were already commenting that Aiden had been seen leaving with a backpack, that he was sleeping in a friend's car, that the house was empty for entire days. No one knew for sure what had happened, but everyone sensed that something big, something shameful, had fallen upon him with the weight of an invisible sentence. I listened to those whispers from the other side of my own life, without intervening, without correcting anything. Silence can also be an instrument of justice. Chantel, on the other hand, couldn't handle the pressure. She never had the patience for silence. She needed stages, an audience, noise, and she looked for it where it would hurt her the most to lose it. She organized a meeting with former assemblymads, distant relatives, and fair-weather friends. All those who, in other times, approached with glasses raised and easy promises. I learned about it through a call I wasn't expecting. From a cousin of Amara, a discreet and honest woman, who spoke to me in an uneasy voice. "Frank," she said, "they are telling horrible things about you. They say you ruined them out of spite." I wasn't surprised. "And what do you believe?" I asked her. "I believe no one ruins others unless there's already something rotten," she replied firmly. "But I also think it's time for the whole story to come out." I hung up without responding. I knew exactly what she meant. That night, for the first time, I understood that my revenge could no longer be solely silent. What they had done to Amara's honor deserved to be exposed with the same brutality with which they had trampled it. 2 days later, I went to that meeting. I wasn't invited. It wasn't necessary either. Those people, drawn by the spectacle of another's fall, would never have had the strength to stop me from entering. I arrived unannounced. I wore black, as I had since Amara's death. The house where they were meeting was full of murmurs, drinks, forced laughter. It wasn't a party. It was a wake, covered up by hypocrisy. When I opened the door, the murmuring stopped. Almost immediately, several stares locked onto me with curiosity mixed with discomfort. Chantel was standing next to a drink table. She was talking to two men who had once closed million-dollar deals with my wife. When she saw me, her face twisted into a furious grimace. "What are you doing here?" she asked loudly. Her tone was meant to humiliate me in front of everyone. It didn't work. "I came to hear what version of the story you're telling today," I replied calmly. Some lowered their gaze. Others settled into their seats with morbid interest. The scene was set. "This man left us on the street," she said, pointing at me. "He took everything, and now he pretends to be a victim." I took a deep breath. "My wife died," I said. "That is a fact. What is up for discussion is how much of you died inside long before that." An uncomfortable murmur went through the room. She took a step toward me. "You took advantage of a sick old woman," she spat. "You manipulated her to take her money." I held her gaze without blinking. "It's funny," I replied, "because she was the one who asked me not to defend you anymore when you were already defending your own greed." One of the women present intervened cautiously. "Frank, maybe this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," I interrupted her, "because many decisions were applauded here without knowing the cost. And the time has come to pay the admission price." I pulled a thick envelope from my coat, the same as I had done the day of the party, but now with a wider audience. Walking to the table felt like crossing a courtroom without a judge. I fanned the papers out with surgical slowness. "Here are the bank transactions from the last 5 years," I said. "The debts my son took on behind his mother's back, the loans requested in her name without her direct authorization. And here," I added, pulling out another set of papers, "are the messages where they mocked her illness while asking for more money." A heavy silence fell over everyone. "That's illegal," one of the associates murmured. "Exactly," I replied. "That's why the law is aware of it now, too." Chantel took a step back. "You're lying," she screamed. "Then sue me," I challenged her. "The truth doesn't usually fear the courts." One of the attendees, an older man who had been a direct partner of Amara, picked up one of the documents and read it carefully. His face darkened. "This explains a lot," he whispered. I nodded. "It explains why the accounts didn't balance, why payments were late, why money was always missing, even though the businesses were doing well. Everything had the same destination: to cover the messes you hid from a woman who only wanted to believe in her son." Chantel lost control. "Shut up!" she screamed. "She's dead. She can't defend herself." "That's why I'm here," I replied, with a calm that chilled the room. "Because when someone dies, the only thing left is their truth. And you thought you were going to bury it with the body." The murmurs grew. The discomfort became palpable. Some started to stand up. Others looked at Chantel with open distrust. "They tricked us," a woman said under her breath. "They said everything was lost due to bad luck." "There is no bad luck when there is sustained greed," I replied. Then for the first time, Aiden appeared. He was in a corner, like a shadow. He had entered without anyone noticing. His face was pale, hardened by sleepless nights. When our eyes met, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, shame without a mask. "Is it true?" someone asked him. "Is all of this true?" He remained silent. That silence was his cruelest sentence. Chantal turned to him furiously. "Tell them he's lying!" she yelled. But he didn't speak. I took one more step toward him. "Here is also the account where you deposited the undeclared money," I said. "What you used to pay for luxuries while your mother was cutting back on medicine so the holes wouldn't show." Aidan lowered his head. "Stop," he whispered in. "Stop. That's what your mother said many times in silence," I replied. "Today we're just repeating it out loud." The atmosphere was now suffocating. People were murmuring without disguise. Names, figures, dates. Everything was starting to fit together for them, with the precision of a long-announced tragedy. One of the men approached Chantal. "You told us he was a manipulative old man," he snapped at her. "But the numbers don't lie." She started to cry, this time without acting. "I just wanted to secure a future," she stammered. "You secured your ruin," I replied, "because a future built on a grave always collapses." Aidan took a step toward me. "Pop, enough," he said in an exhausted voice. I didn't reply. This is exactly what was missing. I pulled the last document from the envelope, the preliminary court order, the notification of an open investigation for fraud, concealment of assets, and wrongful administration. "This no longer belongs only to me," I said. "Now it belongs to justice." A murmur of alarm swept through the room. "You got us all into trouble," she accused me, pointing at the others. "You were already in trouble," I replied. I just turned on the light. One by one, the attendees began to leave. No one wanted to be visibly part of that collapse. No one wanted to be nearby when the shame took its final form. In a few minutes, the room was almost empty. Aidan remained standing in front of me. "I never thought you would do this," he said. "I never thought you would dance on your mother's grave, unknown," I replied. We looked at each other for a long time. There was no longer rage, only a vast emptiness. "You lost everything," I told him. "But the worst thing is that you lost the person who loved you the most." I turned to leave. As I was about to cross the doorway, his voice reached me one last time. "Does this bring Mom back?" I stopped. I didn't turn around. "Nothing brings her back," I replied. "But nothing will stain her memory again, either." I walked out under the gray sky. The cold air hit my face. I didn't feel relief. I felt something else. The certainty that from that night on, my son and his wife would stop hiding their fall in whispers. The world already knew, and public humiliation, once awakened, never goes back to sleep. The day dawned strangely, as if the sky also knew something definitive was about to happen. There was no sun, but no rain either. A whitish light covered the city with a tense silence, similar to the one that precedes tragedies. I woke up early, without startling, with the serenity of someone who has already gone through the worst. I made coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air come in without resistance. Deep down, I knew that day would close a cycle that had begun the very moment I heard Chantal laugh over Amara's grave. The first news didn't take long to arrive. A neighbor, always well-informed, knocked on my door with a serious face. He told me about the unusual activity in front of Aidan's house since early morning. Trucks, court officers, officials with folders, people coming and going with serious expressions. The word eviction floated in the air, like a sentence no one dared to pronounce out loud. I listened in silence, nodded slightly, and closed the door respectfully. I didn't feel joy or relief. I felt the slow, inevitable weight of what was being fulfilled. Mid-morning, my phone vibrated. It was Aiden. I hesitated a few seconds before answering, not because I feared his voice, but because I knew this call would mark the final point of no return between us. I answered without speaking. "Pop," he said, and his voice no longer sounded human. It was a thread broken by panic. "They're already here." I didn't ask who. It wasn't necessary. "They're taking everything from us," he continued. "The house, the furniture, the papers, everything." I closed my eyes for an instant. "That happens when you live off what doesn't belong to you," I replied. "She left," he said suddenly, with a sigh that sounded like defeat. "She left me alone." There was no reproach in his voice, only a dark exhaustion. "Your mother was left alone many times, too," I replied. "Alone in her own house." Aiden went silent. In the background, I could hear voices, commands, the metallic sound of something being dragged. The sound of his collapse filtered through every word. "I didn't know it hurt so much. To lose everything," he whispered. "You lost your mother first, while she was still breathing," I told him. "This is just the consequence that was missing for you to understand it." I hung up. Not because I didn't want to hear him anymore, but because there was nothing left to say. Shortly after, I learned that Chantel had fled with a small suitcase in the middle of the night. No one knew if she had money. No one knew if she would return. There was only the certainty that when the ship truly began to sink, she had been the first to jump without looking back. She had always been that way. She always would be. My son had learned too late what kind of people choose contempt as a way of life. At noon, I went for a walk. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move my body so that my soul wouldn't remain stagnant in memories. I passed by their house. From the opposite sidewalk, I watched furniture, appliances, and boxes being removed. Some onlookers peered out of their windows. Others watched with false discretion, as if observing someone else's ruin were a sin that could only be committed in silence. I walked slowly, without hiding. No one pointed me out. No one spoke. Everyone knew who I was. And in some way, everyone understood why this end was inevitable. On the sidewalk, leaning against a post, was my son. His gaze was lost, his hands empty, his shirt wrinkled. Nothing remained of the man who once believed he was invincible. When he saw me, he took a step toward me. He hesitated. He took another step. He stopped. "Pop," he said. I looked at him, without hatred, without love, without judgment. The way you look at someone who no longer belongs to you. "It's over," he murmured. "No," I replied. "It was over years ago. Today, it's just visible." He brought his hand to his face as if he wanted to tear the shame from his skin. She took a part of the little I had left. "She took what she could grab," I said. "Like always." "I have nothing left," he confessed. "You have the truth," I replied. "And that's the only thing you never knew how to take care of." He looked at me as if he didn't understand. "I wasn't taught to lose like this." "We taught you how to love," I replied. "You were the one who chose to forget that lesson." A dry noise interrupted the scene. A box fell to the ground, broke, and some objects scattered across the sidewalk. An official gave orders. 2 men picked up the remains. Everything continued, with the impersonal mechanics of true endings. Aiden looked at me once more. "Does all of this bring you peace?" I thought of Amara, her tired smile, her silences, the humiliations she kept hidden like thorns so as not to hurt others. "Nothing brings her back," I replied. But they won't stain her anymore. That, yes. He lowered his head. What do I do now? Live with what you chose to be, I replied. It's the only thing no one can take from you. I turned and continued walking. There was no farewell, no promises, no embrace. Only the clean emptiness of the irreversible. That afternoon, the news spread throughout the entire neighborhood. The ruin was no longer a rumor. It was a public fact. Some felt pity, others curiosity, others a distant sadness, the kind contemplated from afar, with a mixture of morbid fascination and relief that it wasn't them who fell. I returned home with slow steps, carrying a weariness that no longer hurt as before, but weighed like a finished memory. At nightfall, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number. I answered. "Mr. Pierce," a masculine voice said, "we are calling from the courthouse to formally notify you that your son has been included in new proceedings for asset concealment." "Thank you for letting me know," I replied calmly. I hung up without adding anything. I didn't celebrate. I didn't curse. I only understood that justice has longer timelines than revenge. But it almost always arrives when the soul has already exhausted everything it had to feel. That night, I ate dinner alone in front of Amara's empty chair. I spoke to her in a low voice, just like every day. Today, they were left with nothing, I told her. Just as you were left without respect long before. The silence answered me as always. But it was no longer a painful silence. It was a complete silence, as if something had closed within me. In the early morning, for the first time since her death, I dreamed without guilt. I saw her from behind, walking through an open field, without weight, without fear, without wounds. She didn't look at me. I didn't call her. I understood that it wasn't necessary. Her story with me was already complete. The next morning, I learned that Aiden had spent the night in a public shelter. No one recognized him. No one helped him. No one pursued him. For the first time, he was living without the shield of his last name, his money, and his shared contempt. He was alone with himself, and that solitude was the inheritance that best represented his life. I, on the other hand, sat on the patio and let the warm sun touch my face. I breathed deeply. I didn't feel joy, but I didn't feel anger either. I felt something new, serene, definitive. The pain had stopped shouting. Now, it just existed. And I understood that losing everything in a single day isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes, it is the only possible path for the truth to finally find a place to stay. The morning was clear when I went to the cemetery. I wasn't carrying flowers. Amara always said she preferred that we plant something living at home rather than leaving something to die on a stone. I walked slowly between the rows of crosses and headstones until I reached her name, Amara and Franklin Pierce. Those two words that had been our whole world for 40 years now rested on cold marble. I sat on the wooden bench in front of her grave and rested my cane between my knees. The wind gently moved the leaves on the trees. For the first time since her death, the place didn't feel unbearable. Everything fell apart, I told her in a low voice, just as you knew it would. The silence answered me with a new calm. I didn't feel reproach. I didn't feel open sadness. I felt a closure, the kind of closure that doesn't scream, that doesn't bleed, that doesn't beg. It just ends. I told her about our son's empty house, Chantel's flight, the public shame that was now pursuing him, like a shadow glued to his heels. I didn't do it with contempt or pride. I did it as someone delivering a final report to someone who knew the ending before it began. She had always known more than I could imagine, And now I understood it with a lucidity that was late, but necessary. I didn't defend you when there was still time, I confessed. But no one fully returns when they retreat too late. Even so, they won't be able to laugh at you ever again. I remembered her face on the last day, pale on the pillow, holding my hand with a strength she had left for nothing else. I remembered how she wanted to say something and couldn't. I thought they were words of farewell that had caught in her throat. Today, I knew they were warnings. I stayed for a long time without speaking. The sun began to rise. Some people walked by in the distance with bouquets of flowers. Each person carried their own grief on their arm. I carried mine in silence. Upon returning home, I prepared coffee for two out of habit. Then I laughed for the first time when I realized it. I poured a single cup and took it to the patio. I sat where we used to have breakfast together on Sundays. The same place where she would read, where I would listen to the radio, where time passed without needing explanations. I took the first sip slowly. It tasted like a definitive farewell. That same day I learned that Aiden had been summoned to testify again. I didn't ask about the charges. They no longer concerned me. The consequences had become autonomous. They walked on their own. At dusk, I went to the land we had bought to build a retirement home, which we never got around to building. She wanted to plant a lemon tree there. We never did. The land was still empty, but the earth was fertile. I knelt down with difficulty and dug a small hole with my own hands. I planted a young sapling I had bought that morning. I didn't need to say her name. The earth knew it. "Now you will stay alive here," I murmured. I returned home with a tired body and a strangely light soul. I had a simple dinner. Bread, soup, silence. The clock marked the hours with a sound that no longer wounded me. The past had stopped beating violently. Now it only existed as a distant echo. That night, I dreamed of our first trip together. We walked down a dirt road, holding hands, young without debt, without betrayal, without shadows. She looked forward. I followed her. There was no dialogue. It wasn't needed. Upon waking, I finally understood something that I had previously refused to accept. I hadn't destroyed my son. He had been building himself in ruins since long before. I just stopped holding up the walls. Mid-morning, I received a message from him. It wasn't a plea, not a threat. It was a short phrase, unadorned. I lost everything, and still don't understand when. I read it twice. I didn't reply. Some answers are more just when they are silenced. I went out to sweep the sidewalk. Simple, everyday gesture. I saw a neighbor walk by with his small child holding his hand. The boy laughed. The father smiled. I thought about how many stories begin this way, and how many end in the same way. I realized that love guarantees nothing. It only gives the opportunity to choose well. And we had chosen differently. Before nightfall, I looked at Amar's notebook again. Those words didn't hurt as much anymore. Now, they were just a truth put safely away. I put it in a locked drawer, not to hide it, but to respect her rest. I turned on the radio. An old song played softly, the one she used to hum while cooking. I let it finish without interrupting it with tears. Not because it didn't hurt me, but because I no longer needed to prove it. I looked out the window. The street was quiet. No one was shouting. No one was running. The lights were turning on one by one in the houses in the neighborhood. The world went on as always, even after the collapses. I understood then that I hadn't won anything. There was no victory in any of it. There was only one thing recovered: The dignity of a woman who died believing that her sacrifice had been in vain. It wasn't. I went to bed that night, not with exhaustion, but with a new serenity. I closed my eyes without fear of the memories, because for the first time they weren't coming as ghosts, but as well-preserved photographs. Before falling asleep, I whispered her name one last time, not as a call, but as thanks. Rest, I told her. And for the first time since her death, I felt that the weight of the past was no longer resting on my chest. It was off to the side, closed, buried, just like everything that should never have lived. Some time has passed since that last visit to the cemetery. The sapling I planted is starting to show new leaves, small, stubborn, alive. Every morning, I water it in silence, like someone conversing without words, with someone who no longer needs to hear them to be present. Aiden never came looking for me again. I learned from others that he is trying to rebuild himself far away, without a last name, without an inheritance, without a past to sustain him. I hold no resentment toward him, nor any hope. There are bonds that die before the people do, and that was one of them. I am still here, walking slowly, learning to be alone, without feeling empty. The house no longer smells of absence. It smells of new time, of fresh-baked bread, of dry leaves swept from the patio, of coffee served for a single cup without guilt. Sometimes, at dusk, I sit where we used to sit together and talk to Amara as if she had just walked into the kitchen. I don't tell her about the past. I tell her about the sky that day, about the bird that landed on the fence, about the tree that is growing. And I feel deep down that she listens without pain. I didn't do everything right. I know, but I did what I could when there wasn't much left to save. I defended her dignity when she could no longer defend herself. And for a man my age, that is the most honest way to keep living. I'm really glad you're here and that I could share my story with you. If you liked it, show me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Let's see how many of us there are. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is. I'm so curious to know where all you wonderful people are tuning in from. If you want to support me a little extra, you can also send a small donation. I share new life stories for you every single day. And now, 2 of my most popular stories will pop up on the screen, so you can choose what to watch next.